All right. Hi, everyone. We are at about 1 minute after 7, so 7 Eastern time for those of you who are here on the East Coast with us. So we are going to go ahead and get started. And we know some of you are live with us on Facebook, but some of you are with us on the Zoom platform. So for those who are on Zoom, we do want to just give you a couple of quick notes before we dive into the information. And we want to start by letting you know that at the top of your screen, you should see an option that will let you choose how this displays. And that'll happen, actually, Eleanor's gonna share her screen. And so when she shares and you can see the presentation, what you'll see is at the top of the screen, some options. And you'll be able to both see the presentation and then also choose so that you can see us while we're talking. So when we share the presentation, if you can't see us, just go to the top of your screen, you'll be able to adjust that. And then down at the bottom, if you're in Zoom, again, for those on Facebook, this doesn't apply to you, it's pretty obvious how to chat, but for those on Zoom, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see 3 options. You'll see chat, raise hand, and Q&A. And you really can disregard the raise hand and Q&A. The only one we really are interested in you looking at is the feature that says chat. And if you click on that box, over on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a big white box, chat box appear. And at the bottom, you'll see a 2. And next to 2, there's a drop-down where you can either pick all panelists or all panelists and attendees. And we would love for you to choose all panelists and attendees. That way, when you share anything in that chat box, if you decide to type anything, then we'll be able to see it, but also everybody else on the webinar will be able to see it too. So go ahead and open your chat and choose all panelists and attendees. That should hopefully get everybody situated with using the platform. And on Facebook, it's pretty clear how you can use the chat function as well. And we'll be trying to keep an eye on both as we go through the webinar. So to get started, Eleanor is going to go ahead and share her screen. And you'll be able to see the presentation, and you'll be able to also see, hopefully, us, depending on your display. All right, perfect. So some of you, or most of you, may have found out about this webinar because you're pretty familiar with us and with What's Your Grief, but we do want to give a little bit of an introduction. Every time we start a webinar, we like to do that so that you know who we are, and if anybody else wants to share who's on, we can do that. Yeah. So my name is Lisa.
I'm Eleanor.
And for those who don't know, we are the co-founders of What's Your Grief. I'm a clinical social worker.
My background is in counseling.
And we have been working in grief and bereavement for each over 10 years now. And we met, many of you know, running an in-person grief and bereavement support program. And in doing that, we were often looking for online resources. And we were often struggling because we couldn't find the online resources that really would have worked for us when we were grieving personally, and didn't always work for the people who we were supporting. And so we eventually decided to start What's Your Grief while we were still working with people in person. And ultimately we've shifted and do kind of a combination of online and in-person things. And in our sort of journey of getting to know each other personally and professionally, one of the things that we realized that was after our own losses, which we both experienced in late teenage, early adulthood years, we both sort of naturally gravitated to using photography as a way to express our grief. And so in talking about this, neither of us had done this through any formal channels. We had not read books or done it with counselors or e-course or anything like that. But we had just naturally gravitated to it. So when we started What's Your Grief, it just made sense that we started talking about how photography had fit as part of our own experience with grief, and how we had actually used it in certain ways with other people as well. And so that was just what we did. And over time, it got bigger and bigger. We'll talk a little bit about our sub-site Photogrief, which some of you might know about, and then also just some of the tools that we have. We've got a lot of free articles that are on our site where we talk about using grief and photography. And then we have an e-course that we offer. And that was really a big motivation of doing this webinar tonight, is we get a lot of questions from people. We get questions about sort of what is the e-course all about. We get questions from people who are sort of like, I'm not a photographer. I've never even thought about using photography to deal with grief. Is this right for me? Would I be interested? Is it a good fit? So we wanted to do a webinar tonight where we just kind of give an overview of why we think photography can be really helpful when you're grieving, some ideas for you to get you started if you want to kind of dabble in this and see what you might like in terms of exploring grief with photography, and just give you a little more information to see if the course is right for you. We have an upcoming one starting, so we wanted to give people a way to sort of stick their toe in the water and see what it was all about before deciding to commit to something like taking a course. So that's our goal for tonight, is sort of to talk about all of those things. To get started, we would love to know a little bit if anybody does want to just introduce what made you jump onto the webinar, on whether you're on Facebook or Zoom, and let us know. I know someone mentioned here doing that they've done the course, which is great to hear. I know we have somebody on from, it's exciting, from Kansas, and some questions about asking if you'll be able to share this video. Absolutely. This is going to live on our Facebook page. You'll be able to access this afterwards if you can't tune in. And if you're on Zoom, we'll be sending it out afterwards, so you'll be able to access that way. So please feel free. And if anybody else wants to jump in and just let us know where you are, where you're watching from, if you want to share who you're remembering, of course you can do that. If you want to share anything that inspired you to jump on, feel free to share that as well. So it looks like we've got a number of people jumping on and saying hello. So thanks and hello to everyone who's out there. And what we'll do is we'll keep an eye on both of these chats as we go through. And please, of course, feel free to jump in at any time, whether it's introducing yourself, asking questions. We'll be responding throughout. So we want to make this interactive. If you want to interact, or if you just want to kick back and watch, that's of course okay too.
Okay, so we are going to, as Lisa said, spend a little bit of time talking very specifically about photography as a tool for coping with grief. But before doing that, we want to take a little time just to talk about coping in general. When somebody dies, I think for many people, one of the first thoughts we're struck with is, how am I gonna cope with this? I don't know that I have the tools to cope with this. And what we know, after having experienced our own personal losses and working people for quite some time who have experienced losses, is that coping with grief takes a combination of just perseverance, resiliency, and coping on a day-to-day basis. And many people have many, many, many different coping tools that they bring together in their coping toolbox and use as they move through the days and months after a loved one dies. So when someone dies, oftentimes the coping tools that are recommended are things like, have you tried a support group? Have you thought about seeing a counselor? Have you talked about it? Have you had a good cry? But rarely does anybody say, have you tried photography for coping with your grief? But we think that this is a really valid coping tool that people maybe haven't thought about, or they actually have started using it without even realizing that's what they're doing. We just did this workshop in person about a week ago, and many of the people there said, like, I just found myself doing this. It wasn't intentional. I just found myself using photography, and I was just drawn toward photographing certain things that related to my loss and my loved one. So this is something that we think is a really accessible tool. And we want to talk a little bit about coping, and I think once we're done, you'll see why we believe that's true. So we have a couple of what's your grief concepts or theories that have absolutely no like research basis or anything. They're just ways that we find helpful for thinking about coping after grief, after a death. And the first thing is, you see we have this little table up on the screen that says, has sort of 3 pillars: emotional, creative, and rational. So we believe that every single person under the sun has their own unique way of coping with stress, hardship, the death of a loved one. But we also think that sometimes we can sort of categorize people by their different preferences and leanings. And we're not the first grief theorists to talk about this. There have been other grief theorists who talk about people who may be more focused on their emotions, while other people are more focused on very kind of rational, cognitive, kind of doing type of grieving. So we're certainly not the first people to talk about this. But we think about it, when we think about it, we think that people sort of lean towards one of these pillars or the other. And it doesn't mean that they are solely only going to cope in that way, but it just might be their go-to or their preference. So some people we think are really focused on their emotions, and they're really sort of working on processing and working through and acknowledging and naming their emotions. So they may be drawn toward doing things like labeling the emotions, talking it out, maybe journaling it out, attending a support group, really confronting things that they're struggling with, like anger, guilt, regret. Maybe they need to make amends and work on forgiveness. So certain people may be really focused on that emotional experience of grief. Then, of course, we have people who are more creative in their coping. So while they might be focused on their emotions and they might like to talk to people from time to time, they really are drawn to these creative outlets. Maybe they like to draw or paint. Maybe you already like to use photography, things like writing, listening to music, learning new creative skills. You guys all know what would go under this column. And then finally, on the far end of things, maybe people might see this as being on the other end of the spectrum as people who are focused on their emotions. We have people who are maybe a bit more hands-on and rational about their coping. So these might be the people who really want to like learn about grief theory and decide how their grief fits into the framework of different grief theories. They may be interested in reading self-help books or maybe memoirs by people who have gone through grief. They may be really interested in doing things like advocacy, education. So those are the three columns that we think about, and you might be like, oh yeah, I'm drawn toward this one rather than the other one. But as I said, it doesn't mean that you are only in that column. So we really recommend that people who maybe really lean heavily towards one side say to themselves, like, maybe I could pull from some of those other columns a little bit and see what that experience is like. So some people might integrate pieces of all the different areas. But we think that everybody copes differently, and then we, among that, have sort of different leanings. Why create in general? So if you are a creative type, you maybe already know the answers to this, but maybe you're somebody who wandered onto our Facebook Live and you're like, I don't know, I'm not really creative. Does this really count as coping? But we absolutely think that creating counts as coping, and we want to emphasize why. Creating art obviously can help to express our emotions. Some of the most powerful works come from a place of maybe deep, deep pain, conflict, or maybe on the other end, deep, deep gratitude, joy, happiness. So there's often really strong emotions behind some of the most powerful works. And people have been talking about this for a very, very, very long time, about channeling our emotions into our work. If you've ever heard the term defense mechanism, or if you know the name Sigmund Freud, most of you do. Way back when they were working about what we say about 100 years ago, he and his daughter Anna Freud talked about defense mechanisms, and one of the positive defense mechanisms, there were many negative or defense mechanisms that could have more of a negative impact. One of the more positive defense mechanisms they talk about was this idea of sublimation. So you sublimate your experiences, your negative experiences, your anxieties into something that is socially acceptable and maybe helps to connect and to share with others. So helps express emotion. Not only that, but it sometimes we, in our day-to-day, just trying to get through it all, right? When we grieve, we don't get to just hit pause on life. We have to grieve alongside our regular life a lot of the time, going to work, going to school, parenting. And we don't always carve out time for us to really be present with our thoughts, emotions, and our loved ones' memory. Not only that, we might not want to carve out that space because it's creating distressing emotions and anxiety for us. But we think that using creativity and creating allows you to kind of get in the zone. Many times if somebody has a creative outlet, they might have this experience of what positive psychologists refer to as flow. So where they're really absorbed in what they're doing and time is just kind of flying by them. And they're really present with what's happening. And so when you are grieving and you intentionally set out to create art based on your thoughts and experiences and memories, it carves out a space for you to actually be present with these experiences without running from them and without distractions. And you'll see the bullet point below, that one says helps address avoidance. So we'll talk a little bit about how this works in some of our exercises when we talk about photographing things related to our grief. So I'll let us get to that in a few minutes. creating art and engaging in anything that boosts your maybe positive emotion, engagement, connects you with other people, can help to relieve stress, anxiety, racing thoughts. It's an opportunity to honor your loved one's memories. So a lot of the art that we've seen, a lot of the photographs that have been submitted to our site Photogrief or that have been shared with us on Instagram are created as a way of honoring and remembering someone who's died. And along with that, it's really easy to share these photographs. And so that's something that's really, I think, useful and helpful. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, it can change the way you see the world. So this one might be a little more abstract than some of the other bullet points, but if you're somebody who is into photography, you might be able to relate to that feeling that as soon as you started really kind of like hitting it off with photography, you started to see the world in pictures. And I think when you start to think about photographing your grief, you start to see some of these reminders and these connections, and you start to see the world a little bit differently. And we're going to talk about how that can connect us to our loved one. We're also going to talk about how sometimes when we're struggling, sometimes when we're having a really bad time or a really bad day, it can help us to shift our perspective in maybe a positive way. So that's why we create in general. And then why do we love photography as a creative tool? First, we think it meets all of those different pillars that we talked about in the beginning. It's rational because it's often, if you're a techie, there's a lot of technical aspects to it, especially if you're somebody who's going to go out and get that digital SLR camera. There's a lot of aspects related to lighting and things like that. So it can meet a really rational need. It's creative, obviously, and we already talked about how it helps us to express our emotions. It's accessible to anybody. So even if you don't want to spend money or you aren't able to spend money on a fancy camera, almost everyone has a phone that takes pictures. So, and if you don't have that, you can invest a little bit of money in a Polaroid camera or in a disposable camera. They still sell those. And point and shoot cameras are pretty inexpensive these days. So it is pretty accessible. And you don't have to take a lot of classes. Like I would have to take a lot of classes to learn how to maybe paint or sculpt. With photography, you can meddle with it, you can fiddle with it a little bit without having to invest a lot of time with the learning curve. The end results can be literal or abstract. So again, going back to things like painting and drawing, the thing that's frustrating for me when I try to draw is it never looks like what I want it to look like. Maybe I want to draw a symbol that reminds me of my loved one, and I can't because I'm not good at that. But with photography, it can be very literal. I can take that picture and there you have it. I'm sharing this literal symbol with whoever I want to share it with or keep it to myself. But you can also create results that are pretty abstract and have more of a hidden meaning to them. You can do it anytime, anywhere. So most people always have their phone on them, whether you think that's a good or bad thing. It's typically true. It's easily shareable, as I said. So if you take a picture on your phone or on a digital camera, you can easily upload it and share it if that's something that you want to do. And we're going to talk in just one second about how it creates community and connection between people. The last thing we want to mention is another one of our what's your grief concepts that we've kind of incorporated different concepts and brought them together to formulate a way that we look at coping. So when we talk about coping, a lot of times people feel like I'm coping with grief, so I have to be thinking about grief all the time. And what we know is that that's not always the best way to go about it. And there's actually, we're not going to get into it, but there are grief theories that say it's important to focus on your grief, but it's also important to take some healthy avoidance and to take a little break from your grief. And so we, of course, on the one hand, think that we need to engage in coping that helps us to directly cope with our grief. But then you'll see on the other side of this diagram, we have well-being. And so we think a lot of coping that falls under that well-being heading allows us to not only process our grief, but also to take a break from time to time. And so when we talk about well-being, we again go back to positive psychology. And they have this Martin Seligman has this theory of PERMA, and he talks about how positive things that help boost positive engagement, so positive emotion, engagement, relationships, give you a sense of meaning and accomplishment. Can contribute to well-being. And so we love photography because we think it's in that sweet spot right in the middle where it helps you to have those well-being moments and boost our sense of well-being, but it also helps us to cope with grief. So that is our that is our final reason why we love photography, that we're going to lay out here as our rationale so you know why this matters. And now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little more in depth about some of these things that we think are most important. Oh, wait, before that, I'm sorry, I forgot that we do want to first mention, because some of you may have tuned into the very beginning of this webinar and then said, nah, I don't know, I'm not ready, this isn't for me, I don't have time. There are a lot of barriers that get in the way of us creating, using photography, and just coping in general.
Right.
I think with photography especially, we hear a couple of different things. The first is I'm not that creative, which we get. I don't know that we would consider ourselves creative types. Like, we're creative, we have our moments, but we wouldn't necessarily say, oh, I'm super creative, I'm super artistic. But it's a tool that I think anybody can use, even if they don't consider themselves creative, quote unquote. People often say they don't have time. And for this one, I'm just going to refer you back to that last little diagram that we showed you. It's coping with grief. So even if you don't have time for maybe a hobby, remind yourself it's not just a hobby, it's helping me to cope with my grief. And that's important for me to take a little bit of time to do.
And also, I think because it is something that many people have cameras on their phones, it's something that you can actually incorporate in your day and in your life in a way that, compared even to some other creative expression, you know, I don't necessarily need to have a canvas on which to paint or somewhere set up in my space. It can be very easy for me to do it in the time and space that I have in my day.
Very true. And then finally, people might think I'm just not feeling it. So a lot of people can relate to this experience, that after their loved one died, the things that they found meaning in, the things that they loved doing before, they no longer really feel a passion for. And that's a very normal feeling for a little while. And so we get it, and we've been there. But one thing that we do know is sometimes if you just force yourself to do it a little bit, it can get easier, and it can remind you of why you loved it in the first place. Even if it's hard, and even if you're not feeling it at 100%, and even if you're not, you know, in the same place you were before, it can help to just engage in things little by little to get you back to that space where you were prior.
And one thing to keep in mind, whether it's photography or anything else, we have this tendency to sort of tell ourselves this story of, oh, I will do X thing once I feel better.
Right.
And sometimes what we don't always see or connect is that not doing that thing is making me feel worse, and actually doing that thing, as hard as it is to do, is part of what will make me feel better.
Right.
And so we sometimes use that thinking of, oh God, I don't have that in me right now, I will eventually, when sometimes switching it around is actually what can help to be that push that we need.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we want to talk a little bit, eventually, obviously, we're going to be talking about what you can do to take photos, but to get the inspiration flowing and to start thinking about this idea of connection and community, one thing we want to talk about and start with is really thinking about other people's photos, because sometimes, especially if you're new to this, and this is an introduction and an overview, sometimes that can be a place where you can really start to understand how this works, why it really works for some people, and you can connect with sometimes the works of other people. So there's a lot of spaces where you can do this and where you can find inspiration. But we're actually going to show you first a few things from our website, Photogrief. And for those who don't know, in addition to running What's Your Grief, we have a little mini creative site called Photogrief, which is a space where we post some challenges, where we post ideas, where we share other people's work. You can always email us your photos that you're taking that are inspired by your grief journey, and with a little bit of writing about them. And we publish other people's photos on the Photogrief site to provide this kind of information or sort of inspiration and community. So that's what Photogrief is, and that's why we created the space. So we have a couple of photos that are on the Photogrief site that were taken by other people. And I just wanted to kind of introduce you to this idea if this whole thing is completely new to you. So if you take a look at this and you look at this photo, and anybody who's there in the chat or can easily type, if you have any thoughts about what this photo makes you think of, I would love to know what those are. Feel free to write this in the chat, because part of the process of looking at other people's photos is we know that the photographer had something in mind. They had something that they were trying to capture in that moment. And in the case of grief and photography, oftentimes something connected to their grief. But what's interesting is when we're grieving and we're coming to other people's work, we're often wondering maybe what the photographer had in mind, but we're also bringing our own experience to the work. So we're bringing to that photo sort of something about maybe our own life, our own loss, our own experience with what we're seeing. And so that's part of what makes any form of art so can make it such a way to connect with people, is because we bring so much to it. So hopefully you've at least had a minute, even if you're not sharing in the comments, to think about what you see in this photo. This photo is titled, actually, 6 Empty Chairs. And this photo was taken by Elizabeth Burgess and submitted to us on Photogrief. And I'm going to read to you what she shared with this photo. She said, "I took this photo at an outdoor sporting event for veterans last spring. It seemed to perfectly represent that no matter where we go, there will always be 6 empty chairs. One for my stepson, Brian, one for Frank, one for Offren, one for Jeremy, one for Dustin, and one for Jameson. They all lost their lives together in a battle in Afghanistan on March 29th, 2011. So with this photo, I think once we look at the photo by itself, we have that opportunity to bring our own experience to the photo. And then part of the reason that we ask people to share some words on Photogrief is because we do like to sometimes help people who are looking to connect and for inspiration to know what is behind some of these photos when when you wouldn't necessarily otherwise have that text. This is another photo. I encourage you to do the same thing, whether you type your thoughts about it in the chat or just take a minute to look at this photo and think of what it brings up for you. This is a photo that obviously you can see someone took the opportunity to edit. We now have all these amazing tools, and we're going to talk towards the end of the webinar about what some tools you can use if you want to do things like change filters, make it black and white, add text onto your photo, things like that. We have amazing ability to do that now so easily with technology and phones. So this was a photo that someone submitted to, and I just lost the photo, submitted to our site. And this was a photo that he submitted, and his name is Terry, and he lost his son, Brian. And after losing his son, Terry was really struggling at work. And so he submitted this photo to us and titled it "The Grief Distraction." And he wrote, "When I was laid off from my previous position last August, the reason given was that I, quote, seemed distracted and unfocused on the job. This photo attempts to show what I see and feel every single minute of every single day. It is a struggle to keep the grief from crushing me, and I try my best to honor Brian and his sacrifice. If you know or work with someone who has experienced a devastating loss in their life, please know that they are struggling to keep putting one foot in front of the other, much less perform their job duties. This is our new normal, and we thank you for your patience and understanding when we seem, quote, distracted." So I think, this again is one of those instances where, especially if you yourself have experienced distraction and grief, which is such a common experience, that inability to focus and concentrate, that this photo oftentimes when we show it to people in in-person workshops or talk about it right away are able to identify that feeling of maybe being overwhelmed by thoughts of that person to a point that it makes you unable to sort of function in other ways. And being able to capture that in a photo is really powerful. The last photo here, no surprise, I would love for you to consider what you see when you look at this photo, like each one, because this is another photo that was submitted to us on Photogrief by someone who was grieving. And this one's a little bit more, abstract, I'd like to say. And in this photo, it was taken by Kim. And she says about this photo, "I've lost both my parents in the past 2 years. Right when I thought I had a handle on my mom's passing, my father was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive bladder cancer and passed just 18 months after my mom. I've been the one to make sure all of the documents of their lives are taken care of. A few letters and photographs I've sent to their friends, but what about all the rest? What do I do with years of tax returns, vehicle registrations, and canceled checks? Last week, I shredded decades and decades of documents from my parents, tiny pieces of their lives, cross-cut for security, but I can still see my mother's perfect handwriting. Tiny, perfect squares of 2 lives that ended too soon. They look just like my heart, cut into a million tiny pieces. So again, I think one of the things we find really powerful is sometimes once you start thinking about the world through photography and creative expression, you start to see these moments where maybe before you would never have thought that this is something that I would want to capture photographically. But when the emotions are coming up, when it's welling up, and when it's clearly a really powerful moment in our grief, sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, it becomes a moment where capturing it photographically feels really meaningful and important, and sort of a way that you can connect with your emotions, express those emotions, and capture something that you realize may be hard for other people to understand and connect with. So those are a few on Photogrief. There's many, many, many more photos and different submissions on Photogrief that you can look at. There's also, and we'll talk more about this towards the end, we did a photo challenge in February on Instagram. We're going to be doing another one coming up in June. But for that photo challenge, we used the hashtag WY grief photo. So WY grief photo was our hashtag for the whole challenge. And when I last looked the other day, there were over 1,100 photos that were on Instagram on that hashtag. So you can certainly use that as another place to get inspiration and to see other people's work. I see some people commenting here on Facebook about how powerful those images are and what they capture. So please, if you're looking to connect with other people's sometimes amateur photo work, Photogrief and Instagram on this hashtag are a great place to do that. There's also a lot of professional photographers who are out there who are using photography as a way to express their grief. And we will include a few links when we send this out to those who signed up for the Zoom webinar of some of these photographers. But this is just a handful. If you want to look up some people, Kirsty Mitchell uses really amazing sort of fantasy photography, very elaborate makeup and sets and designs to remember her mom, who was an English literature teacher and who really raised her on fairy tales. And so she became inspired to actually become a photographer in order to capture some of these images. Beryl Ann Young is a photographer who does a lot with infertility and miscarriage and pregnancy loss and capturing that experience through photography. Elizabeth Fleming is a photographer who did a really incredible photo essay on the day of one of her grandparents' funerals, capturing sort of the morning of the funeral in their space where they lived, and captured some really powerful images that really is great if you're looking at photo essays. Shay Rosemeyer, who lost her daughter, was also a professional photographer and captures really powerful images connected to grief. And then Eleanor is here. Certainly is someone else who, if you follow along with Photogrief or What's Your Grief or any of the work we do, or certainly in the course, will see and know a little more. And we'll talk more today about using photography as part of her grief. So we're going to shift from this inspiration of thinking of other images to taking your own images and what creating your own images is all about. And one of the places we want to start, because we think looking and connecting at other people's work is really important and inspiring and a great way to connect. But it can also be a little bit intimidating. And sometimes you look at other people's work, especially if you look at professionals' work and you think, I have never taken a photo other than maybe a family snapshot or anything else in my life. I don't have an artistic eye. And we can start thinking this is intimidating or this isn't for me. sometimes you start the process of taking photos, and I will be the first to say this because I, am not a professionally trained photographer at all. And it can be a little bit discouraging because you're trying to capture something and maybe it's not coming out exactly how you would like, or you just feel like you're not, getting what you would want. And so sometimes it's really important when you're doing this process, especially as a way to express and cope with grief, to remember that the process of creation is often what's so important about this. As we get into these different ideas and activities, one of the things that we really are looking at is how do you connect with your own sort of emotions and the things that are important to you in your grief, the things that remind you of your loved one or that continue your connection with your loved one. And so much of that is just the process of reflection, of taking the photos, of thinking about what they're going to be. And with time, we all get a little bit better and we improve at things, but really it's not about the end result. It's not about sort of and creating this perfect photo, but often about the process involved in taking photos.
Yeah, I would add to that many times you set out to take a certain photo and you end up taking one that's totally different. And that can be sort of a surprising and pleasing experience for many people. And it can tell us a little bit about the different ways we can look at things and maybe the different stuff that's going on inside our heads that we didn't fully realize. So I want people to be open to just following the process wherever it takes them.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk today. There are so many different avenues where you can take photography as a way to cope with grief and to explore grief and the emotions of grief. Today, as an introduction, we're really just going to look at three areas and just kind of scratch the surface on each of those areas. So feelings and emotions, we're going to talk about that, how grief and how grief and photography can be somewhere where we can dig into that area. Symbols. So it's amazing how much of our world becomes connected with the person who we've lost and our grief and the emotions, good, bad, complicated, everything that it brings up for us. And photography can be a really interesting way to engage with that piece of our world. And then, as Eleanor mentioned, hope and strength. Sometimes photography is something that can help to pull us through some of the deepest, darkest moments in different ways. And so we're going to look at that area as well. If you're interested in more, like we said, photo grief, we're going to have an upcoming photo challenge, and we have the upcoming e-course. So this is just a place to get you started for today, but there is more.
Yes. So first we're going to start with emotions. Emotions are interesting because it's one of the more abstract places to start. If I ask you to photograph happiness, you might think first of, okay, I'll take a picture of somebody laughing and smiling, but then how do you photograph that beyond that overt physical expression of that emotion? So we're going to talk a little bit about a few of the different ways that we can express emotion. And before that, we're going to just want to provide a rationale for why we think this is a valuable exercise. The first one is that when we use photography to express our emotions, we are able to capture the emotion, to think about the emotion, to process the emotion, and if we care to share, to put it out into the world and tell people, here, this is how I'm feeling. And we can do all this without having to talk about it. So many people can relate, even people who like to talk things out can probably relate to having those moments or those times when they're just like, I don't want to talk about it. I'm not in the mood. I just want to cope with this inside my head or on my own right now. I'm not in the mood to talk to my friend or go to a therapist or a support group. So this is one of those great ways to express emotion, and if you care to share emotion without having to talk about it. We think that there is immense value in just taking some time to sit with our emotions, to be present with them, to feel them, and to explore them. A lot of times we have these emotions in grief that we are maybe a little scared of or hesitant to confront or fully allow ourselves to experience because we think we aren't going to be able to handle it. Or once we let that feeling in, we're not going to be able to get rid of it, or we're going to lose control. And approaching it in this way allows us to sort of intentionally approach this emotion in a way that lets it in, maybe in a way that we have more control of it and can maybe look at it at an arm's length, but we're still allowing ourselves to be present with it and to see it and feel it. And finally, when we photograph emotion, if you start to do this on a regular basis, you can always look back and see how your emotions have evolved. And now that might be that you feel like you are having a bad day and today you're feeling bad, and you can look back maybe a week ago and see a happy moment or a moment where you felt immense peace or connection with your loved one and say, I'm feeling terrible right now, but I could feel this way again. Or on the other hand, it might be that you have some photographs from early grief that feel very filled with things like just anguish, hopelessness. And as you progress in your grief, you might see that those photographs change a little bit. And the emotions that you see are a little less maybe distressing, overwhelming. Sometimes people will say that their color returns to their world. So even you might see a little bit of color returning to your photographs. So you can see how things have evolved and changed over time. So we're going to give an example of a general exercise. There are a lot of different exercises that can fall under this heading, but we want to keep it general for the purposes of this like very basic webinar. So we want you to right now think of an emotion, maybe one that you're dealing with right now. So maybe one that you're feeling in this present moment, or that you've been feeling maybe over the last week, or one that has been really predominant in your grief. So maybe it's something that's making you feel stuck, something you can't get past, something that feels overwhelming, something that you've been avoiding. So we want you to think of what that emotion might be. And if you are open to it, we would love for people in the comments on Facebook and also on the Zoom webinar to just, when you know what that emotion is, to just share that emotion in the chat, so we can see the different kind of ranges of emotions that people are trying to process and maybe trying to find ways to express in their grief. And also, if you do this and share it right now, this is kind of like a way of you saying like, okay, I'm going to do this, right? So there's a little bit of an accountability factor. And then we would love for you to follow back up with us and show us how you did actually photograph that emotion. So please go ahead and share that in the comments when you have one, if you feel comfortable. If not, that's totally fine. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the different ways that people can approach expressing emotion photographically, and we are using images for the most part. I think almost all of them, maybe for this one, are from Instagram. So we have the person who took it is credited in the top right where their username is, and you can find these on Instagram. And we're so grateful that people have shared these photos with the grief challenge that we did a little while back. So the first one is sort of obvious. We can take a photograph of emotion by photographing somebody feeling it. So it could be that you see other people expressing that emotion in the world around you, or you could do this via self-portrait or selfie. So we're not actually going to explicitly talk about self-portraits and selfies today. That's something we get into in our course, and it's always an interesting topic because some people are like, no, I'm not comfortable with it, but we're not going to get into that today because that's a whole other animal. But the most obvious way to photograph emotion is through a portrait. And you can see that in this image, you can't even see the person's face in the image. So those of you who are less comfortable with putting yourselves in front of a camera, we want to remind you that there are many different ways to capture a self-portrait that aren't just like head-on, like, ooh, you know, taking a photo like this. You can do it a lot of different ways and create really, really great images without it being a traditional portrait. Here's one that is from the challenge that we did a little while back. And this is a great way of photographing emotion. And you can see that this is a little more abstract. And so what's great about this image is I see it, I know it's related to grief, but I can bring my own experience to this photograph. But thankfully, I think Mary is her first name, and I'm sorry if that's not correct, was willing to share a little bit about her experience along with her photo. So the prompt for the day was mood. And she said, being widowed is sometimes like living in the shadows. There are days you feel lost and wonder who you are now. You're suddenly no longer someone's spouse. What are you? Sometimes you want to go through the day invisible because you feel so bad, but you have to function. And some days you want to scream out your pain and anger and sadness in the middle of a crowded place, but you bite your lip. And I think that's a really amazing way of capturing this sometimes need to be kind of in the shadows and hidden, and sometimes this need to be seen. And so you as the viewer bring whatever you bring to that image. But I think with these common grief themes, we can really relate to these images. And then finally, this one is from Lisa.
I can talk about this. So I think, again, in one of the things that can be so wonderful and powerful about photography is that sometimes you see things that are very concrete and you relate to them, the idea maybe of those shadows or things that you see in the world that sort of convey a specific emotion. And sometimes it is very abstract. So for me, and I wrote in this was part of our challenge when we were challenged in February, and the challenge was mood. And I was really, really struggling for a lot of reasons, including that I was really, really sick and just really kind of in a bad place in the winter. And as I said in here, I think, had taken a lot of cold medicine, and I was trying to sort of push myself and force myself through the day, but really struggling. And this that I saw, really just the colors and sort of the fact that it was disorienting so much connected with how I was feeling in that moment and a mood that I was trying to capture. And so it was something that, again, was just not at all concrete and tangible, but just in that moment spoke to me and felt like something that was worth capturing.
And sometimes you set out to create something. You say, okay, today my mood is feeling very like blue, right? So you might set out to capture a photo just like this, or like Lisa said, you just kind of see it and say like, yeah, that like pretty much sums up how I feel right now. So those are a couple examples of using emotion to photograph mood. And there are others, of course. And so we really want you to think about what are the different ways that I could approach photographing some of the emotions that I've been struggling with expressing and exploring.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited to see that Mary, who took the shadows photo, is here on. Here. So, hello. Next we want to talk, again, we're just kind of scratching the surface and giving ideas, but we want to talk a little bit about symbols. And symbols are something that, interestingly, when we have done the e-course in the past, sometimes we started with emotions and asking people to photograph their emotions, and people would often come back with photos of symbols.
Yeah.
And we would say, no, wait, that's later. So we actually sometimes encourage people to start with symbols and then move on to emotions. But I think the reason we would find that is because oftentimes symbols are so connected to emotions that we almost confuse those things.
Right.
And rather than capturing a photo of our emotion,
right,
we capture a photo of the thing that's causing the emotion or that's triggering the emotion. And so that's the great thing about photography. It can actually allow us a way to be connected and stay connected with those objects that bring up such clear emotions. And those objects can be places, they might be things that are special to you or important. Sometimes they're things that we have to part with, things that we can't hold on to. And it's a way for us sometimes to be able to really connect with those objects, those places or things in different ways. And sometimes it allows us, and we see this in the course a bit, sometimes to face a triggering object or place, something, a symbol that reminds us of our loved one, with a sense of purpose. And sometimes people have been avoiding a certain place, a certain thing, something that just has so many, I haven't opened the closet because I can't bear to look at the clothes hanging there, or I haven't gone back to this place because it just brings something up for me. And one of the things that we think can be really powerful about photography is it gives us a sense of purpose. If we're going to photograph certain reminders or symbols or objects or places, that then pushes us to go and look at those things. So with that, we want you to, again, think of a very basic exercise, which is just to photograph a very specific place, object, or reminder of your loved one that maybe you have been avoiding, or one that just brings up really complex emotions for you. So maybe you haven't been avoiding it, but you're still in that place where it's a little bit overwhelming or a lot for you. So we encourage you to think about what an object like that might be, or a place, And if you're comfortable sharing in the comments, we would love for you to share. And we're going to show you a few examples while people do that. So the first is thinking about a very concrete object. Elle, do you want to talk a little about this?
Yeah, and this is going to come back up in just a moment. So this is something that I photograph on a regular basis, and actually this is doesn't quite align with our exercise, but it aligns with something we're going to talk about in a few moments. But this is a symbol that reminds me of my mother. My mother always talked about acorns. They held a very special place in her heart ever since dating back to when she was dating my father. And then when she was sick with cancer, she said, you know, that this acorn necklace that she had stood for strength. So my sisters and I all have the same necklace, and it's become a very important object for me. So this is a symbol that actually makes me feel very connected to my mother in a very positive way. And this is something we encourage people to photograph these objects as well, of course. But I photographed it in a number of different ways. And this is just one example of one of the many ways that this has come up in my photography over time.
And so again, we have another symbol, and this is one that I know you can, it's funny, actually, we don't talk about it a lot, but piano is another one that connects for me too. And I think for a lot of people, because instruments so often connect, and music connects us, they belong to someone in our life. But do you want to mention anything else about that?
Yeah, I mean, with my mom, she played the piano. I think I would see her playing the piano every day for, you know, at least like half hour, an hour a day. And this was, when we go back to talking about that idea of flow, this was the thing that for her, she just was totally immersed in and just loved doing. And so, of course, pianos hold a very special significance. There's my daughter's handwriting on the keys. And so being a mother is also something that is very symbolic for me and very connects me to my mother. So this is just, you know, one of those reminders of the connection that I continue to have with my mom.
Perfect. And sometimes, like we talked about, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is that sometimes the reminders are places, and that is sort of a symbol or a reminder. And sometimes those might be a place that we went with our loved ones, spent time with our loved one, that we know that our loved one went. Or sometimes it may be something like this. It may be somewhere where you feel close to your loved one now because it is at a cemetery, or where ashes were spread, or just some other reason that you feel close to your loved one in that way. So when we think about photographing places, one of the things to keep in mind, some places it's very normal and, you know, it makes sense to photograph. But sometimes, as we've talked about this before with cemeteries or with certain places, it's not, some people may not in your life be as comfortable with those photographs, but it's really about thinking about yourself and what works for you and connecting to the things that are going to be important for you in looking at taking these photos of places.
And conversely, there definitely, I think sometimes with things like graveyards and things like that, there will be people who maybe don't get why you want to take a photo of that. But on the other side of that, if you have people who live far away and can't visit that space, taking a photo and sharing with them is a way to connect them with that place that they can't access themselves.
Absolutely. So Eleanor mentioned before, obviously, this as an object that's really special to her. And part of the reason I wanted us to include this is because I think one thing that where we can be a little limited sometimes when we're gonna photograph one thing, we just think about that one thing, one time, one way. And so much I think of the process of photography and symbols can be that can look really different. So
yeah, I mean, I think with certain objects, if you start to do this often, you may find that object shows up in many different spaces over time. And that's like something that's kind of, you know, can be neat to experiment with, allows you to see the object in different ways. And it maybe just becomes that like fun thing where you have that reminder of your loved one, you know, crop up everywhere in your photography or anything else that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is an example of something that for me became both about object and place. I recently cleaned out my childhood home, And in doing so, came upon these old letters that had been written back and forth between my grandparents. And that it's a huge box of old letters from when my grandfather was in the war. And I was going through so much and going through my childhood home that I was honestly too overwhelmed to start reading the letters. Like I knew that that was going to be too much for me in the moment. It was going to get me to a place where I wasn't going to be able to functionally take care of the things I needed to be doing in the house. But I felt overwhelmed by this sense of wanting to take a photo of this box of letters that I found. And I felt like that was something that was important to this sort of emotional moment that came up for me. And it was really a manageable balance between opening up all these photos and reading them, but still allowing me to sort of take some time and place and be present with them. And in doing that, I realized that these letters were written back and forth when my grandmother was still living in the house where my father was first born. And my dad was born in DC, as you can see. And when we were kids, he would not take us to the house that he had grown up in because that part of DC was pretty rough by the time that it's very nice now. But when we were kids, and he just, you know, when we would go to DC for lots of reasons, he would just say, no, we're not going to go there and see it. So I had this was the first time I had the address and really knew where this was. And again, it felt important to kind of take some photos of that. And then later, it was actually around when this was happening, it was around the anniversary of when my dad died. And so I decided to actually drive down and see the house with sort of a goal of taking some pictures as I went. I stopped by a deli where I knew my dad worked in high school. And then ultimately went and found and took a photo of the house where he was born, which ended up just being sort of a process for me that, as we talked about in the beginning, is sometimes it gives you a sense of purpose or something to do, and that can actually be surprisingly helpful. So for me, that was just a way that, again, these different symbols became important to capture, and it was a combination of sort of object and place that both became important. So one of the things that's interesting, and I think this is another photo that brings together that idea of object and place, is sometimes there are spaces that our loved ones occupied, and those spaces in maybe in our environment, and it may be, you know, that we encounter day to day, and it may not be at all. It might be something very specific and outside of your environment. But another way to capture symbols is sometimes this idea, we call it like an empty chair activity. It doesn't literally have to be a chair, though our examples are chairs, but where you capture a photograph of a space that your loved one used to occupy. And sometimes those empty spaces, like I've said before, it's that idea that that absence almost becomes a presence in and of itself, because you can almost picture the person in that space. And so it's another place where sometimes we'll avoid those spaces, or sometimes we're going to have to change those spaces. Sometimes maybe that space was in a house that now you have to sell, or for whatever reason things have to move or readjust, and it's never going to be exactly as it was when you imagine your loved one there. So this can be a powerful activity and photography challenge to sort of allow you to be present with that space and capture it in some way, maybe before it changes, or even if it's going to stay the same, to capture it in some way.
So those are, again, just a few ways to capture symbols. You guys might even already, this I think is a little bit easier than thinking about abstract ways to capture emotion. So hopefully you guys are inspired to pick up a certain object or visit a certain place and give this a try. And it's a great place to start, I think, when you're just getting started with trying to photograph grief and related experiences and emotions. So the last category we're going to shift to is just a very broad category that we throw everything under, which anything that can give you a sense of hope, comfort, strength, purpose, meaning, connection, gratitude, joy, anything that maybe goes under this, like I look at this photo when I want to feel good type of category. And we love when people have these photos on hand wherever they go. Maybe they keep them in their phone. I know I am known to be flipping through my photos, just looking at photos of my dog. I have 2 daughters, but I'm looking at my dog usually. because those are the things that make me feel happy. Those are the things that give me that boost of positive emotion. And when you're in the depths of grief, you're going to be like, yeah, looking at a photo of a dog isn't really going to help me all that much. But remember, we're talking about these little things that just shift the gauge ever so slightly. And what we do know is that sometimes when we give ourselves that opportunity to experience the positive emotion, research has been shown that when we smile, even without having any purpose, it can boost our mood. So it's not without purpose, it's not meaningless, and what's the hurt in trying, right? So these can be reminders for tough moments. They can help to shift our perspective. And quite often we find that these symbols and photographs are really connected to our loved one's legacy and continued impact in the world. So many photos that are shared with us are symbols of strength and symbols of inspiration, because it's a way that we see that our loved one continues to live on and to influence people in the world. So here's our exercise. Here's our challenge to you. We want you to think about photographing symbols or reminders that make you feel strong, inspired, and hopeful. And that is a very, very, very broad challenge. And we would love it if you would share right now in the comments what you're going to photograph or what you think you could photograph, any ideas that you have, because A, it could help other people come up with ideas, and B, again, that accountability piece. So there are a lot of different ways to go about this, and of course there are, because there are so many different symbols and so many different objects and pictures. But a couple that we love and that we see come up a lot, we're going to share. So the first one is just words, verses, lyrics, poetry, anything, phrases, things like that, that make you smile, that make you feel better. This one is not just a word, but it's a beautiful mural as well. So when you see it, photograph it and keep it with you for that inspiration, or share it with other people. So there's one. This is one that was shared with us on Instagram, and it was in response to the challenge of the prompt hope. And we love this one because it really embodies the way that we can find hope and connection through just these like very personal moments, personal and private moments that we have that maybe just give us a sense of peace, or maybe make us, allow us to feel connected with our loved one. She shared yesterday I overindulged in social media and I fell down. No matter how much I filter out the news, it's still there. Even when I quickly scroll past the post, it's still there. It can be hard to have hope in today's world, so today I'm back to the basics, grateful for what I have in my little corner of the world, enjoying a pot of tea and getting some work done with breaks for coloring and naps here and there. So that is a day, that is time she has set aside for self-care, for, as she said, getting back to basics, and something that allows her to feel that comfort and peace.
And sometimes when we're having a bad day, capturing those good moments or how we got through those other bad days and looking back, it can be a good reminder. You know, it can be a good reminder of like, okay, yes, those are the things that help me to feel grounded or to feel better when I am feeling bad. So when you do sometimes manage to pull yourself out of a deep, dark day, sometimes capturing that can help you on another deep, dark day to remember what it was that helped and pulled you through.
Absolutely. That's a good point. And then there are these symbols that we see. Again, this was shared with us under the hope prompt. And Rachel shared, hope is such a beautiful thing and a major part of grief. Grief is such a dark thing, but there's always that little glimmer of hope that gets you through. There are so many things I hope for in my grief, that I can be a good mom to both my girls and live a life that makes them proud. I hope that baby Presley Luna knows how much we love her, and I hope that we never forget her. And so this, I think, I think that this image probably speaks to almost everybody who sees it, and you can relate maybe to that feeling of just sometimes having to allow things like hope and happiness and meaning and purpose to grow from some of the most dark, complex, and barren places. So this is one of those photographs that reminds me of hope and resilience and growth. A couple of others that we want to mention. I'm actually going to let Lisa share this one because it is her story.
It's my story. So for those of you who follow us, you might know we use a hashtag called would have loved this, hashtag would have loved this. And this came about because a good friend of mine whose mom died a number of years ago is incredibly good at keeping her mom's memory alive with friends and family and doing events. And for years, for her mom's birthday, she would always do something that she used to do with her mom. So she would invite everybody to go one of her mom's favorite restaurants, somewhere her mom always used to go. Until one year she decided and sent a message to everybody saying, I want to do something a little bit different this year because the movie 50 Shades of Grey is coming out. And I know if my mom was still alive, what she would have wanted more than anything is for everyone to go see 50 Shades of Grey together. So she got a big group together of her mom's friends and of her friends, and we all went and we saw 50 Shades of Grey. And, you know, she just said at that time, my mom would have loved this. And I thought so much about that idea that our relationship with our loved ones who've died, it's not just about the things that we did with them in the past. It's about the fact that we continue to encounter the world in ways where we see things that they never got to see. And we encounter moments in the world that they never lived to encounter. And we think to ourselves, oh God, they would have loved this, or this is something, I wish they were here for this. And so this hashtag is just a way to try to capture those moments. And you might not do the hashtag, you might not share it on social media, but you might use the idea or that inspiration to capture those moments and send it to somebody else, to take a photo and say, hey, you know, wouldn't Jim have just loved this? So we have other examples. I took this one at a restaurant because my dad loved oyster stew. And so it was really amazing, you know, this really amazing bowl of oyster stew. And I thought my dad would have loved this. Some that have been shared with us on social media. You know, you see the two boys playing the guitar here and singing, and all Sarah says is this would have made him very happy. Hashtag would have loved this. And this one, about 7 years ago, my mom bought this bread for Spring, who is the dog, Spring, because it said Happy Spring on it. Springy has never been interested in it, but just now she curled up in it for the very first time ever. We all miss you, Mommy. Hashtag would have loved this. And this one, I think in many ways, you know, really conveys that continued connection, and that there are sometimes those moments, and taking the time in a photographic way or in this would have loved this way to capture sort of the bittersweet that comes with every moment after a loss. Turning my tassel. I know I've posted a lot, but I haven't been this happy in forever. I wish my mother were here to see me, but I'm just as proud because the truest test is to finish what I started without her here. She definitely passed down the strength of our ancestors, and I feel like there's no stopping me now, especially with God. What a weekend of blessings. Hashtag would have loved this. So again, sometimes it's capturing those moments and having a deliberate reason to think about how it connects us to our loved ones.
And the final example that we want to share is just this idea of finding things to be grateful for. And so there is actual research behind the idea that engaging in a regular practice of finding gratitudes, maybe journaling a gratitude to 1 to 5 gratitudes a day or something like that, can help to improve our well-being. However, the reason Lisa and I particularly like gratitude challenges and finding gratitudes and photographing challenges is because sometimes we can get kind of negative and kind of in these funks. And in those moments, we haven't done one in a little while, but we'll say to each other, like, we should probably do a gratitude challenge because we need to shift this perspective just a little bit. So one of the reasons why we love this in grief is because it helps us, again, to shift those perspectives when we feel like all is lost, when we feel like nothing will ever be good again. Challenging ourselves to stop and find one thing to prove ourselves wrong that there's nothing good can be a helpful exercise. We do often, there's a term called confirmation bias that we talk about in psychology a lot, and also with people who do research. And it's the idea that sometimes when we're expecting to see a certain outcome or something in the world, we go out and only attend to those things that prove our bias, so that confirm our bias, and we ignore all the other things. And so maybe we're having a bad day and we think people are terrible, and so we ignore the person who held the door open for us or who smiled at us on the street, but we definitely noticed that guy who cut us off in traffic, and all we can think about is what we wish we had done instead of just driving by meekly, right? So we can have this tendency to get really focused on negativity if that's the zone that we're in. So we often like to challenge people to find gratitude, and we know that when you are grieving, the last thing you want somebody to be like is find something to be grateful for, right?
Right.
We get it. Like, we get it. We get how patronizing it can seem. However, we don't mean like go out and be grateful for everything in your life. We mean just like stop and be like, I'm grateful that I was able to have my morning coffee this morning, so I feel a little bit more alert. I'm grateful for the fact that it stopped raining today when it's been raining nonstop here in Baltimore. So it can be just the smallest things. So here are some examples of very small things. Grateful for my dog's stupid grin. Grateful the hydrangeas I thought I killed are blooming. Grateful for sympathy cards that don't suck. So you see they crossed out all the other platitudes and left at the bottom just there are no words, and we love that sympathy card. And grateful for fortune cookies that tell me what I want to hear, so no need to worry, you will always have everything you need, it says. And then finally, this was one we posted during our Great Gratitude Photo Challenge. Grateful everyone will understand I didn't feel grateful enough to come up with gratitude yesterday. So we get it. We get that some days it's just like, no thank you. But we do encourage you when you feel like you have the strength or the tolerance to give this exercise a try.
All right, so we are wrapping towards the end, but we wanted to share just some tips, tools, if you're going to be dabbling in this, if hopefully you're gonna at least try these 3 very basic introductory challenges that we put out for you today, or if you're gonna go on Photogrief or on that hashtag and look for some inspiration, we would love for you to have just some tools to make it a little easier. So many smartphones now, if you're using your smartphone, have a good built-in or at least a built-in video editor, photo editing program within the camera. But you may want to get one that is a little more advanced and gives you a little bit more flexibility. So one of the ones that we like a lot is VSCO, which is found in the App Store, and it's on both Android and on iPhone. And you can do a lot of different things, from using just built pre-existing templated filters, kind of like the filters on Instagram, but there's more of them and with more flexibility. And then you also can just do a lot more of your own editing of the photos than you can do on something like Instagram. Another one that you might want to look into if you're interested in doing, we showed, though we didn't really get into self-portraits today, we showed some self-portraits that other people had taken. And sometimes people will ask, well, if I don't have a fancy camera with a timer on it, I'm just using my phone, how do I use a timer? Some phones do have a timer in their camera, but some phones don't, or it's a very simple one. This is a great app called Photo Timer Plus, which is an app that lets you set your phone up somewhere and you choose how many photos do you want it to take and how many seconds in between the photo. So I could set up and say, I want to set my phone up, I want it to take 10 photos, 10 seconds apart. And then you can walk away and you can go and you can be the focus of the self-portrait or part of the photo and give yourself some time to do that. So it's a really good timer app. One question people will sometimes ask is, how do I make those photos that have words on them, where I type either maybe a verse, a song lyric, something, or just if you want to type anything else onto your image. An app that we really like for that we think is really user-friendly is called Tipic. There's tons of apps out there for all of these things. These are just a few of the ones that we think are user-friendly and that we often use. There's another app if you're interested in getting like a little bit more creative with your work, called Enlight. And the Enlight app actually lets you take different photos and layer them together. So this is an example of one that I did where I took a photo of some trees and a photo of myself, and I layered them together, and you can kind of use your finger to take away some of each image to kind of blend them together in different ways. And it's pretty cool. You can get some cool techniques. I'm not great at it, but here's an example of a photographer here in Baltimore. She's on Instagram at Caitlin Obscura. And she is the person who actually I first saw this app using it. She's a professional photographer and really shows how you can do some really cool stuff with this if you practice a bit. And last but not least, another app that we would like to mention is called Stellar. And Stellar is an app that's really designed for photo essays. And though we didn't go into photo essays today during this, we do go into photo essays more in some other places, some posts, and in the e-course. And photo essays are a great way to sort of use photography to tell a story, and oftentimes incorporates writing, sometimes not. And Stellar allows you to integrate those photos and everything together in a really cool format that's sort of like a book-like format. So those are just a few to get you started. We don't have a lot of time today.
If you have others that you recommend, please share it in the comments and chat area.
Mary just asked a good question. She asked, will the webinar be available for replay? I missed the beginning. And yes, that's good to mention now because we said it in the beginning, but some of you probably didn't make it at the beginning. So this will be on replay. You'll be able to access it on our Facebook page. Also, if you registered for the Zoom webinar, we'll be emailing it out. Or if you'd like it as an email by Zoom so that you can have a link and not have it just in Facebook, just email us whatsyourgrief@gmail.com and we'll make sure that we email it to you. Also, Winthrop mentioned that nobody used that hashtag on Facebook. The hashtags that we use, we really primarily use on Instagram. So though we're here on Facebook, Facebook in general doesn't do as much with hashtags. So the Would Have Loved This on Instagram has a lot of use. And then also the WY Grief photo, like I said, I think has about 1,100 on Facebook, people who have shared on it. On Instagram, but not so much used on Facebook. So so that's where you'll primarily see that.
So what's next? Okay, so we've given you guys a couple of places to start. So I think what's next should be that you guys all go out and give this a try if you haven't already. You can also, we didn't put this here, but you can also submit photos that you've already taken to us to be shared on PhotoGrief. Our posting there has been a little sporadic, but we are hoping to get back more regular. And you can email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com with your submissions for that. We do appreciate if you share a photo and some text along with it to give some context for the photo. So we referenced that we did a prompt challenge, and that was back in February. We did this primarily on Instagram. We did it a little bit on Facebook. We are planning to do another challenge throughout June. So that means that every day of June, we will have a different prompt. And we will be doing this one a little more regularly on Facebook as well as Instagram. So if you did register for this webinar, we will be emailing you a copy of the challenge. If you are following us on Facebook, we will be sharing this on Facebook pretty soon. So if you are just interested in trying to get started, and that way you can do our June challenge. We also have a ton of free articles on What's Your Grief. Then last but not least, for people who have a little bit more time and want to invest a little bit more in this, we are doing an e-course. It's a 6-week e-course. And so part of the reason why we wanted to do this free webinar is to give people who are considering that course a little bit more information so that they can make an informed decision about whether this is a good choice for them. So we are doing an e-course starting next Monday on May 28th. Right here, is an example of our past photo challenge. So if you don't want to wait till June and just want to do a challenge with prompts, go ahead and start doing this one, and then keep an eye out for June's as well. But then also just a little more information about the course. It starts May 28th, so in a week. It will be taking place on What's Your Grief, so all the lessons will be on What's Your Grief. Lessons will be given to people on Monday, and they'll have all week to kind of work through them. There'll be some assignments for people, and when we say assignment, it means if you want to do it, we encourage you to do it, and you can be flexible about how you do it. And then we're going to have a secret Facebook group where people can share their photos and connect and comment and support one another. So you can register on our website, and you can use the code FRIEND when you register to get $20 off the registration fee, just because you hung in here with us for this webinar. And just a few other things about that. We love This is one of our favorite courses to do because we love connecting with people around their work. There's a lot of specific guidance, techniques, assignments, and self-exploration. Completely supportive and totally judgment-free space. People of any skill level are welcome. A space to share and connect with people. A direct way to access course instructors for support. And it's a good reason to get started. So sometimes you just want that accountability piece. So we would love for people to participate. If you're not ready this time around, we totally get it. And we will be offering this again soon. And we hope that you will join us and connect with us on Facebook and Instagram in the meantime. And then finally, if Lisa, you don't have anything else to add, our website is whatsyourgrief.com, and you can reach us for questions and messages and comments or anything you want at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com.
And right now we what's the cost of the course? So the 6-week course is normally $100, but with the $20 off, that makes it $80 in total for the course. And like we said, it starts on the 28th, and then we will have another session that will probably run end of summer, early fall. Usually we do another one then, so that you can kind of have that on your radar.
It does go 6 weeks, which I know could seem intimidating, but people can take it, as they want to take it. And people, even though the pace of the connection and the group will be, keeping up with real time, people will have access to the course for a lot longer if they want to continue to work through.
Yeah, usually we give you access for at least 6 months after, so you can go back if you don't have time, or you want to dig deeper into some of the lessons or the challenges. It does give you time to go back after that.
So as we said, we will be emailing out a link to this recording, as well as links to some of the stuff that we've talked about. If you are watching this on Facebook and want us to just forward you a copy of that email, please reach out to us at Gmail, at our Gmail email address there, and just let us know, like, hey, can you forward me the notes page for this webinar? I'd love to have a look at it.
And if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat right now, because we do have a couple more minutes left. And otherwise, we really appreciate you hanging in tonight. We hope that you got a little bit of inspiration to get yourself going, however you decide to take next steps with photography or any other creative expression.
Yes, and please share the stuff that you create, even if you're not going to share it publicly on Instagram or Facebook or wherever. Please share with us. We'd love to see it.
We'd love to see it.
Because this is one of our, hopefully you can tell, this is one of our sort of passions when it comes to coping with grief. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope that you all have a lovely evening.
Yes, we'll hang in a few more seconds. So we will definitely share the notes, Mary. If you definitely email us, we'll make sure, if you weren't registered for the Zoom, that you get the link that'll include our notes page. So that will definitely be there. Okay.
All right.
I don't see any other questions coming in. So if there are others, just email us. Otherwise, everyone have a great evening.